The winter that descended on Ashworth Park in the third week of November 1843 was not the kind that arrived gradually. It came like a debt collector, sudden, unapologetic, certain of its rights. The wind off the northern moors drove sleet against the tall windows of the east wing, in sheets, and the footmen who had spent the morning carrying coal could not get the corridors warm. Every mirror in the public rooms showed the same gray sky. Every candle and every chandelier fought for its flame, and mostly lost. And at the edge of all that cold magnificence, seated at a writing table no one had bothered to clear of last week's correspondence, was Octavia Ashworth, checking figures in an estate ledger that had not been properly maintained in 11 years. She wore a gown the color of pewter, 3 seasons old and unfashionable, in precisely the way that signals a woman who has not had occasion to think about fashion. Around her, Ashworth Park was preparing itself for the arrival of the Duke of Blackmere. Footmen carried flowers up the grand staircase. The housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, directed 3 maids in the polishing of the silver with the steady authority of someone who understood that appearances were the first form of argument. The east drawing room had been warmed since dawn. Fresh linen had been pressed and laid in the best guest quarters. The entire household was performing its most expensive version of itself. Octavia turned a page in the ledger and found what she had suspected for 2 days, a discrepancy of £340 in the wool merchant accounts, traced backward through 4 separate entries to a transaction dated June of 1841 that bore her uncle's handwriting and no countersignature. She wrote the figure in the margin with her particular, precise hand. Then she pressed her fingertip against the page for a moment, as though confirming something that had been trying to become real for quite some time. And she heard the carriages in the drive. She did not go to the window. Her uncle, Sir Aldous Ashworth, would be bringing the Duke up the front steps himself. She could already imagine the performance of it, the wide gesture toward the park, the speech about the timber holdings, the careful omission of anything that concerned the state of the accounts or the Ashworth family's actual position in the world. Sir Aldous was an accomplished man in the specific way that men of his generation were accomplished. He could host a dinner, manage an impression, and defer a consequence indefinitely. Octavia closed the ledger and set it aside. She had been managing the consequences for 6 years. She picked up her list. The Duke of Blackmere was 34 years old, unmarried, possessed of a title that carried 3 estates and a seat in the House of Lords, and had been described in every London letter Octavia had read as the coldest eligible man in England. She did not know what that meant precisely. She suspected it meant he did not flatter easily. She heard his voice for the first time in the entrance hall below, not the words, only the register, low, unhurried, as though the weather inconvenienced him not at all. She returned to her list. 20 minutes later, she looked up to find that the Duke of Blackmere had walked directly past the east drawing room, where Sir Aldous had clearly meant to receive him, had turned left along the corridor that led to the estate offices, and was standing in the doorway of the room where she worked, looking at the writing table, the ledger, the candles she had lit herself because the footman had not come, and at her. He was tall, dark-coated, and dressed with the precise economy of a man who wore authority as a structural matter, rather than a decorative one. He did not bow. He said, "You are the niece." It was not a question. It was a piece of information. He was confirming against prior knowledge. "I am," Octavia said. She did not rise immediately. She finished the notation she had been making, capped her pen, and then stood. "And you are Blackmere. Welcome to Ashworth Park." He looked at the ledger on the table, then at her, then at the window, where the sleet had not stopped. "How long have you been managing these accounts?" he said. She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has not been asked a direct question of substance in a very long time. 6 years, she said. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had already measured. Then he turned and went to find Sir Aldous in the drawing room, and Octavia sat back down, picked up her pen, and thought about the £340, and about the way the Duke had looked at the ledger, not with desire, not with charm, with the measuring attention of someone who had just identified something they did not yet understand, and intended to. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but she thought, with a precision that surprised her, that she would not need to. The years that had produced Octavia Ashworth were not years anyone would have chosen deliberately. She had grown up at Hartwell, the smaller of the two Ashworth properties, in the care of a father who understood mathematics as a form of grace, and who had given her, before anything else, the ability to read a balance sheet, the way other women were taught to read music. Her mother had died when Octavia was 9. Her father had died when she was 19, leaving behind a property in better order than it deserved given his modest income, a library of solid and practical books, and debts to 2 creditors who arrived within a fortnight of the funeral with the confident bearing of men who knew exactly what they were owed. Octavia had been the one to meet them. She had been 19 years old, wearing her mother's black dress, let out at the seams, and she had sat across from them at the dining table that was already promised to the estate sale, and she had presented them with a repayment schedule she had written out the night before by candlelight. It was not generous to them, it was mathematically exact. It gave them what they were owed at a pace that preserved enough of the estate's liquid assets to maintain the property through its sale. They had looked at her with the particular expression of men encountering something that did not fit any category they had prepared for, and they had signed. That was the first time Octavia had understood that precision was a form of power available to her even when every other form was not. Within 3 months of her father's death, she had settled both debts, overseen the Hartwell estate sale, and arrived at Ashworth Park with a trunk of her father's books and a letter from her father to his brother that said, in effect, that Octavia was useful and should be treated accordingly. Sir Aldous had read the letter, noted that she had no dowry and no prospects, and assigned her to the household accounts before the week was out. She had been managing the Ashworth Park accounts within a month of arrival. She had been managing the estate accounts, the wool merchant contracts, the tenant farm agreements, the timber sales, the quarterly creditor negotiations, within 3 months, because it had become apparent almost immediately that the person doing it before her had been doing it very badly and charging Sir Aldous £50 annually for the privilege. Octavia had absorbed the role without comment and without additional payment, which was the usual arrangement between a woman with nowhere else to go and a household that needed someone useful. What Octavia did, year after year, was not simply keeping the books clean. It was operational management of a significant rural estate during a period when wool prices were unstable, when 2 of the tenant farms required capital reinvestment or would collapse, and when Sir Aldous's social ambitions consistently produced expenses that outpaced his income by margins that required quarterly renegotiation. She had renegotiated the timber contract in 1840, recovering £60 annually, by adding a clause requiring the merchant to bear the cost of transport over half a mile, a clause the previous manager had never thought to include. She had restructured the tenant farm agreements in 1841 in a way that tied a portion of the rent to documented crop yields rather than fixed quarterly payments, which had stabilized income during the bad harvest of 1842 in a way that would have otherwise required Sir Aldous to borrow against the property. She had identified, in the spring of 1843, that one of the wool merchant invoices was consistently overstated by small amounts, 2 or 3 shillings at a time, in a pattern that over 18 months represented £23 in overbilling. She had documented it, presented it to the merchant without accusation, and recovered the amount in a credit against the following quarter's invoice. No one had thanked her. She had not expected thanks. She had expected the accounts to balance, and they had. There had been one moment. It had been a Tuesday in February 1841, during the worst of the winter, when 2 of the tenant families had sent word that they could not meet their rent, and a creditor in Leeds had sent a letter that Sir Aldous had handed to her without opening, and gone to dress for an afternoon call, when Octavia had sat at this same writing table and pressed both hands flat against the surface, and thought, with a clarity that was very nearly grief, that she might be doing this forever, that she might spend the whole of her life keeping a house, standing for a man who would never look at the numbers, and that the numbers would balance perfectly at the end of it, and no one would know they had balanced, and that would be the whole of it. She had sat with that thought for perhaps 4 minutes. Then she had opened the creditor's letter, read it, written a reply that deferred payment by 45 days, while proposing an interest adjustment that actually reduced the long-term cost, and returned to the tenant farm projections. She was not going to become less than she was, not for a creditor, not for Sir Aldous, not for a winter that would not end. She had decided that in February 1841, and she had not revisited it. The other thing she had, besides the accounts, was music. Her father had taught her to play. She had not played at Ashworth Park in 6 years, because the pianoforte in the drawing room was for guests, and the drawing room was Sir Aldous' space, not hers. There was an older instrument in the music room on the second floor that had not been properly tuned since before she arrived. She knew this because she had checked the estate records for the tuner's invoice and found it dated November 1830. 13 years, but she had gone there sometimes, late in the evening when the household was quiet, and played it anyway, hearing past the imprecision to the music underneath. She had not known anyone could hear her. She had assumed the room was far enough from the occupied quarters to be safe. She had assumed, in the way she assumed many things about her own situation, that she was essentially inaudible. This had turned out to be incorrect. Nathaniel Ashby, Duke of Blackmere, had arrived at Ashworth Park, carrying a great deal of information about the estate, and almost none about the woman who managed it. He had retained an investigator in September, before accepting Sir Aldous' invitation, because he did not accept invitations without understanding what he was accepting. The investigator's report had been thorough on the condition of the property, the state of the wool contracts, and the character of Sir Aldous Ashworth. It had noted, in a single subordinate clause near the end of the third page, that the estate accounts were managed by the baronet's niece, a Miss Octavia Ashworth, who had been performing this function for approximately 6 years. The investigator had not elaborated. He had not thought there was anything to elaborate on. Nathaniel had underlined the clause. He had not known precisely why. He had thought about it for 2 days and then sent a second inquiry, specifically about the accounts. Were they well maintained, and had the estate avoided the liquidity problems that the investigator had flagged as likely given Sir Aldous' spending patterns? The answer had come back that the accounts were, by all accessible evidence, remarkably well maintained, and that the estate had navigated 3 consecutive years of agricultural difficulty without requiring outside borrowing, which the investigator considered surprising, given the baronet's evident dispositions. Nathaniel had read this report twice and thought about the woman who had done it. He had come to Ashworth Park because Sir Aldous had made an offer that was structured around a potential marriage. His niece was of appropriate age, the baronet had written, and the families had historic connections, and a match would be agreeable to all parties. Nathaniel was 34, and his solicitor had been making the same argument about succession for 3 years. He had resisted not from indifference to the estate's future, but from a very clear knowledge that he was not an easy man to live with, and that the women who had been presented to him at London assemblies over the past several seasons had wanted, quite reasonably, something warmer than he was in a position to offer. His mother had been warm. She had died when he was 12, in the spring, in the kind of sudden and incomprehensible way that spring deaths always feel, too incongruous with the weather to be believed. She had been the one who played. She had been the one who made Blackmere Hall feel like a place rather than a structure. After she died, his father had managed the estate as a machine, which it had become, and Nathaniel had managed himself the same way. It was efficient. It had not made him happy, but he had not been seeking happiness particularly. He had been seeking someone who understood that a large estate in the north of England was first and foremost a complex financial and agricultural enterprise, and that running it well was not a task that could be left to men who were too busy managing their impressions to read the accounts. He had walked into Octavia Ashworth's office by accident, following the corridor away from the drawing room, because Sir Aldous' performance in the entrance hall had been so transparently arranged that Nathaniel had felt the need to walk away from it before he formed an opinion he would have to revise, and he had found a woman, in a pewter-gray dress at a writing table, surrounded by the specific evidence of real work. The ledger open to a page of figures, the annotated margins, the pen uncapped, the candles she had lit herself. He had asked how long she had been managing the accounts because it was the only relevant question in the room. 6 years. He had nodded and gone to find Sir Aldous, and spent the rest of the afternoon listening to the baronet explain the estate's prospects in a way that managed to describe, without ever naming, everything Octavia had built. He had drunk tea in the east drawing room, and eaten the dinner that had been prepared, and listened to the baronet's eligible niece being described, over the remove, as accomplished in the usual ways: watercolors, French, a pleasant disposition. He had not said that he had already met her. That night, he could not sleep. The house was quiet by 11. He had been given the best guest quarters, which were comfortable enough, but the sleet had stopped, and there was instead a deep country silence that he had forgotten existed, Around midnight, when he had read the same page of his book 3 times, without absorbing it, he heard music. It was coming from above, from the second floor, a pianoforte, slightly out of tune, played by someone who understood the music well enough to hear past the instrument's limitations. It was a composition he recognized. His mother had played it. He had not heard it in 22 years. He did not move for a moment. He pressed one hand flat against the wall beside the bed and held it there. Then he put on his coat and went upstairs. He stood outside the music room door for 40 minutes. He did not open it. When the music stopped, he went back to his room, and the following morning he sent word to the tuner in the village to come to Ashworth Park at the earliest possible occasion, and instructed that it was to be done at no cost to the estate, billed directly to him. He did not tell Octavia. He told no one. The next evening, he found a reason to remain on the second floor at 11 o'clock. He was reading in the corridor near the window that overlooked the park, an arrangement that required no explanation since he was a guest and could choose to be wherever he wished. And when the music began, he stood and listened, and this time he understood something he had not been able to name the night before. She was not performing. She was thinking. The music was the way she thought when the ledgers were put away. He stood there for the second night, and the third. On the fourth morning, he asked Sir Aldous if he might extend his visit by a week. Sir Aldous, who was by this point deeply invested in the outcome of the visit, agreed immediately and asked no questions. There was no formal announcement of a match. There was an understanding. Sir Aldous Ashworth had made the understanding very clear over dinner on the second evening of Nathaniel's visit. His niece was available. The arrangement would benefit both families. The Duke's position and the Ashworth connection were agreeable, and he had said it all in the particular manner of a man describing a transaction, which it was, from his perspective. Octavia had sat at the far end of the table and eaten her fish, and looked at no one in particular. But Nathaniel had watched her hands. She had kept them still on the table, which he had come to understand required effort from someone who spent most of her time either writing or managing something. The effort of stillness was its own form of information. The difficulty, which was not small, was Lady Felicity Carney. Lady Felicity had been present in the London social orbit for 2 seasons as the most credentialed candidate for Blackmere's attention. The daughter of Lord Carn, 23, fair, possessed of a dowry substantial enough to be mentioned in drawing rooms by other people's mothers as a figure, a natural beauty, and, which was more to the point socially, exactly what a Duke of Blackmere was expected to acquire. She had been at Ashworth Park for a fortnight before Nathaniel's arrival, invited by Sir Aldous on the grounds that she was Octavia's cousin by a distant branch of the Ashworth family, and she had understood perfectly well that the visit was structured around the Duke's probable preference. She was not unkind exactly. She was the system made flesh. She believed entirely, and without malice, that merit was a matter of birth and presentation, and that she had both, and that anything else was beside the point. She had arrived at the writing table on Nathaniel's second afternoon at Ashworth Park on the stated grounds of needing to write a letter, which was reasonable enough. She had looked at Octavia's ledger and her annotated margins and her ink-stained forefinger with the particular expression of someone filing away information about an opponent, and had said, with a smile that was almost warm, "You do keep yourself occupied, Octavia. I cannot imagine spending my days in figures. It would give me a terrible headache." Octavia had looked up from the page. 29 of the 37 annual supplier agreements renew in the first quarter, she said, with complete evenness. If they are not reviewed before Christmas, we miss the renegotiation window and pay the previous year's rates, whether or not they remain competitive. It is less a question of preference than of timing. Felicity had blinked. Then she had written her letter at the far end of the table and left without saying anything else. Octavia returned to her list and did not permit herself the satisfaction of having answered well. Satisfaction was not a currency she had much use for. Results were. What she had not anticipated, what she would not have known to anticipate, was Nathaniel. He had come to find her in the library on the 5th day of his visit, in the early afternoon, when the household was at rest after the midday meal. She had been there because the library had the estate's original ledgers from 1810 onward, and she had been tracking the history of the wool contracts to build a complete picture of the discrepancy she had found. She had 5 of the ledgers open across the library table, and was moving between them with the particular focused efficiency of someone solving a puzzle that other people have not noticed is a puzzle. He came in, assessed the scene. 5 ledgers, annotated notes, the cold afternoon light through the tall library windows, and took the chair on the opposite side of the table without asking. "What are you looking for?" he said. She told him. She told him about the June 1841 transaction, the missing counter-signature, the pattern of overbilling she had caught before in a different account. She told him in precise language, without flourish, laying out the evidence in the order she had found it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Do you have the merchant's original invoice from that quarter?" She did. She found it in the third ledger and slid it across the table. He read it. He read it again. Then he said, "The sum here is different from the entry in the estate account by £14. "Yes," she said, "I know." He looked at her. She could not read his expression exactly, but it was not the expression of a man who had expected this answer. It was something closer to the expression of someone who has been looking at a map and has just realized that the map is better than they thought. They worked in the library for 2 hours. He did not offer help. He contributed. He had his own facility with accounts, which she had not known to expect from a duke, and he had the instincts of a man who had been managing a large estate since his father's death 6 years prior. They did not speak of anything except the figures. When the light faded, she lit the candles herself, and he went to the window and stood for a moment, looking at the park. "My solicitor will want to review this before any formal action can be taken against the merchant," he said. She noted that he had said before any formal action, not if any action is taken. He had already decided. "I have a summary document prepared," she said. 7 pages, annotated with the relevant ledger pages. He turned from the window. "Of course you do," he said. It was not sardonic. It was something warmer than that, and she thought he had not meant to let it be. She handed him the document. He read the first page standing at the window, while she put the ledgers back in order. He was still reading when she finished. She looked at his profile for a moment, the line of his jaw, the precise set of his coat, the fact that he had removed his gloves to handle the pages, and his hands were careful with them. "Your cravat has been crooked since this morning," she said, "approximately 40 minutes before you came to find me." He looked at her. Then he reached up and adjusted it by touch, which did not help significantly. "Still," she said. He crossed to the window where a small mirror hung, used it, and returned to the document. She thought she saw the corner of his mouth move. She was not certain. She picked up her list and went back to work. He returned to the library the following afternoon, and the one after that. By the third afternoon, there was a rhythm to it that she did not examine too carefully, because examining it felt like the beginning of wanting something, and wanting things had not historically served her well. What she did instead was work. She finished the summary document, expanded it to 9 pages, with a revenue projection showing what the recovered margin would represent over a 5-year period, approximately $400 annually in net recovered income, compounded by the renegotiated transport clause, and she mapped, for the first time with full precision, the complete financial picture of Ashworth Park. It was a more complicated picture than anyone but Octavia knew. The estate was not failing. It was surviving on the strength of decisions she had made, and it had been close to the edge more than once, and it would need either continued skilled management or a significant infusion of capital to move from survival to genuine stability. She wrote this in the revenue projection, in the particular language of someone who states a fact and leaves the implications visible. She did not state the implications. They were visible. She gave the full document to Nathaniel on the 4th afternoon in the library, without preamble, while he was removing his coat. The room had been overwarmed for once, and the fire was generous, and he looked at the additional pages and then at her. "You're telling me what this estate actually costs," he said. "I'm telling you what it costs and what it returns, and what has kept it functional," she said. It seemed relevant. He sat down. He read for a very long time. Outside the library windows, the park was bare under the pale December sky, the grass silvered with frost, and the afternoon was quiet, except for the fire and the sound of turning pages. She worked on the supplier agreements at the opposite end of the table and did not look at him. When he finished, he set the document down and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking up from the page, "My mother used to play in the evenings. When I was young, I had not heard that composition since she died." Octavia set down her pen. She had not known anyone could hear her. She had been certain of it, And now she understood that he had known, for the whole of the past week, and had said nothing, and had sent for the tuner, and had stood in the corridor for 3 nights, and never opened the door. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table. "I am sorry," she said, "for the intrusion. I did not know the sound carried." "It doesn't," he said. "I came to listen." She thought about that for a long time, after he had gone. On the morning of the 10th day of his visit, Nathaniel went to Sir Aldous and made an offer for Octavia's hand. He made it in the formal language that the occasion required, citing the family's historic connection, the baronet's social standing, and the suitability of the match in terms of age and character. Sir Aldous accepted with visible relief, and the particular enthusiasm of a man who has been attempting to engineer an outcome and has just watched it arrive without him. The betrothal was announced at dinner that evening. Lady Felicity was present. She sat across the table from Octavia with a stillness that was perfect and not entirely successful, and looked at the arrangement with the expression of someone who has lost a hand she was certain she had been dealt. Octavia received the announcement with the same composure she received most things. She thanked Sir Aldous. She met Nathaniel's eyes briefly across the table and held them for a moment. He did not smile. He looked at her with the direct attention she had come to recognize as his equivalent of a great deal. She did not say what she was thinking. She thought, "I have managed this estate for 6 years. I have kept it standing against figures that would have brought a lesser operation to its knees. I have done it without acknowledgement, without credit, and without adequate compensation. And now I am to be removed from it by an arrangement my uncle engineered for his own benefit, and placed in a duke's household that I have never seen, on the basis of a betrothal I had no formal part in accepting." And she thought, "And he listened to me play his mother's composition for 3 nights in a corridor without saying anything. And when I gave him a 9-page financial document, he read every word of it, and the only person in this room who has asked me what I am doing and meant the question is him." She picked up her fork and continued her dinner. She had managed worse situations before breakfast. The journey to Blackmere Hall in the 2nd week of December was made in the Duke's carriage, which was warmer and better sprung than anything Octavia had ridden in since her father's time. She brought 1 trunk and the estate ledgers, the ones she would need to finish the documentation of the Ashworth discrepancy, and a small bundle of her father's books. She brought nothing decorative and nothing she had not earned or been given with intention. Blackmere Hall was larger than Ashworth Park. It was also, she could see as the carriage came up the drive, running along its bones in a way she recognized, the maintenance deferred in small decisions that accumulated, the east wing that had not been opened in some time, the kitchen garden walls that needed repointing. It was a house that had been managed well at the operational level. The accounts, she would discover, were in order, but that lacked someone whose attention extended to the whole of it. She noted all of this without urgency. She had not been here long enough to begin anything yet. She was received by Mrs. Emmeline Garr, the Blackmere housekeeper, a woman of 60 with a broad, plain face and hands that showed decades of domestic authority. Mrs. Garr looked at Octavia's trunk, at the bundle of ledgers, and at Octavia herself, and said, "I've had your rooms prepared on the south side, miss. It's warmest there, the north suite is handsome, but in January you'll want the south." It was the first practical welcome Octavia had been offered by anyone in a household in 6 years. She felt it like something slightly tender behind the sternum, and breathed past it. "Thank you, Mrs. Garr," she said. "I should like to go over the domestic accounts with you when you have a suitable hour. Not immediately. I don't want to overturn anything before I understand it. But within the first week, if you're agreeable." Mrs. Garr looked at her with a particular expression that Octavia would later come to recognize as the housekeeper's version of approval. "Agreeable, miss," she said. "Very." Within 3 days, Octavia had also acquired Margaret Tilson. Margaret was 28, had been lady's maid to a family in Yorkshire before her previous employer's death, and had been assigned to Octavia's service on Nathaniel's instruction. She arrived with direct opinions about the arrangement of Octavia's rooms, and an indignation on Octavia's behalf that was entirely unperformed and entirely disproportionate to the very slight remarks that had caused it. When, at a dinner in the first week, the Blackmere estate solicitor, Mr. Charles Rhine, a man of 60 who had served the family for 30 years, had referred to the incoming Duchess as the baronet's niece, in a way that managed to make it sound like a deficit, Margaret had returned to Octavia's rooms afterward and said, with the precise fury of a woman who says what she thinks because she has decided she is going to, He said it as though Baronet's niece were a diagnosis. Octavia had looked up from the accounts she was reviewing. "It is a form of assessment," she said. "A fair one, by his lights. I don't object to being assessed. I object to being assessed on a single variable." Margaret had sat down uninvited on the bedroom chair and said, "Then you'll need to show them the rest of the variables." Octavia said, "Yes, that is exactly what I intend to do." She had liked Margaret from that moment, with the particular warmth one reserves for people who state the obvious without condescension. The other person who saw her clearly from the beginning was Mr. Edmund Fairshaw, who had served the Blackmere estate as a senior advisor, part solicitor, part financial counsel, part institutional memory, since before the previous Duke's time. He was 70, small, precise, and had the eyes of a man who had spent decades reading documents and had grown to understand that documents did not lie in the way people did. He had come to Octavia's private sitting room on the 4th day of her residence, entirely uninvited, carrying a file of correspondence related to a disputed boundary on the Blackmere northern pasture, and had placed it on her table and said, "You will need to understand this before anyone else tries to explain it to you, because they will explain it wrong for their own convenience." She had read it immediately, in his presence, while he drank the tea that had been brought for her. She had asked 3 questions. He had answered 2, and said the third had not occurred to him. She had written a note in the margin of the file. When she looked up, he was watching her, with the expression of a man who has been hoping, for quite some time, that something would change. "You managed Ashworth Park's accounts for 6 years, he said. "Yes. Alone. Yes," he said. "Good. Then you will not be frightened by what I am about to show you about the Blackmere Western Timber Holdings." She had not been frightened. She had been, in fact, briefly delighted, the way a very competent person is delighted when they discover that the problem is genuinely complex enough to require everything they have. The difficulty with the Western Timber Holdings was that they had been leased in 1837 under terms that were now actively disadvantageous, and the lease was due for renewal in February 1844, 8 weeks away. The terms as written gave the merchant a rate fixed in 1836 values that was now substantially below market, and the lease renewal clause gave the merchant the option to renew on identical terms for a further 5 years, which he was very likely to exercise. The estate was losing the equivalent of £220 annually, against what it should have been recovering, compounded across a 5-year renewal period, to a sum that made Octavia sit very still for a moment. "The previous Duke's solicitor drafted this," Mr. Fairshaw said. "He is no longer with the estate. Mr. Rhine took over in 1840. He has reviewed the lease twice and considers it adequate." Octavia looked at the lease. She looked at the renewal clause. She looked at the rate schedule. She spent 2 evenings in the library and produced a redrafted renewal clause that preserved the merchant's position on all the terms he was likely to care about: security of supply, volume guarantees, payment schedule, while adjusting the rate to current market value and adding a review mechanism tied to a published price index, so that the estate would never again be locked into a fixed rate across a 5-year period without protection against market movement. She brought it to Nathaniel on a Wednesday evening in the library, where he had taken to being in the late afternoon when the estate's business day was finished. She handed him the document. He read it. He read it again. "Rhine missed this," he said. "Rhine was looking at whether the terms were technically valid," she said. "He was not looking at whether they were advantageous. There is a difference." Nathaniel looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was him paying full attention. "You are going to want to present this before the renewal window closes," he said. "The merchant can be approached directly. He will expect to simply sign the existing terms. I expect to present the revised clause to the merchant's representative, to Mr. Rhine, and to your full advisory council," she said, "before the end of January, so that everyone understands the reasoning." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Rhine will resist." "I know," she said. "He will consider it an implication of his competence." "It is an implication of his competence," she said. "The estate has lost £1,100 over 5 years because of that lease clause. I intend to recover it going forward. Mr. Rhine is welcome to review my reasoning and find the error in it." Nathaniel looked at the redrafted clause again. He was quiet for a moment that she could not read. Then he said, "Edmund Fairshaw thinks you are the most capable person to manage this estate's interests that he has encountered in 40 years of advisory service. She sat with that for a moment. It felt, quietly and precisely, like the thing her father had told her when she was 15, and had balanced the Hartwell accounts for the first time without help. It felt like being seen by someone who understood what they were looking at. "Mr. Farshaw is generous," she said. "Mr. Farshaw is not generous," Nathaniel said. "He is exact. There is a difference." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the library windows, the December dark had come down, and the fire was warm, and the room was very quiet. She thought, "I have been keeping rooms standing for a long time. I had not expected to be in one that felt like this." She picked up her pen and returned to the revised clause. He did not leave for another hour. The advisory council met in the third week of January. This was not a small occasion. Blackmere's council comprised Mr. Rhine, 2 senior investors who had holdings tied to the estate's commercial interests, an agricultural advisor, and the Duke of Blackmere's father, Lord William Ashby, who held no current title of authority, but who attended the council as a matter of long-standing practice, and whose opinion carried the weight of precedent. Lord William was 71, lean, precise in his dress, and had spent 2 decades managing the Blackmere estates before his son took over. He had been opposed to the match from the moment he heard of it, not from cruelty, but from a genuine and entirely sincere conviction that the Duchess of Blackmere ought to come from a family whose standing was commensurate with the title, and that a baronet's niece managing another family's accounts was not that family. He had said this to Nathaniel in a letter that Octavia had not read, but had known about, because Nathaniel had told her. He had told her in the library, standing by the window, in a tone that was flat and factual. "My father considers the match unsuitable," he had said. "Yes," she had said, "he is correct by the reasoning of his world." Nathaniel had looked at her. "He is not correct," he said, "but he will not be changed by argument." She had understood this. She had not attempted argument. She had continued with the timber lease clause. The council room was long and cold, paneled in dark wood, hung with portraits of previous Blackmere dukes, that had the particular authority of rooms that have been important for a long time. The investors sat along one side of the table. Mr. Rhine sat at the foot. Lord William sat to Nathaniel's right. Octavia sat where Nathaniel had placed her, at Nathaniel's left, with her documents in front of her, and her hands still on the table. Mr. Rhine had been informed of the agenda item. He had reviewed the original lease and the proposed revision. He had prepared objections, which he had told Nathaniel were substantial, and which Octavia had anticipated in detail. She presented the revised clause herself. She did not ask for permission to speak. Nathaniel had made it clear before the meeting that she was presenting, and she had taken him at his word. She spoke for 14 minutes. She placed the original lease, the redrafted clause, a market rate analysis she had compiled from published merchant records, and a 5-year projection showing the recovered margin side by side on the table, and directed the council through each document in turn. She stated what the estate had lost. She stated what the revised clause would recover. She identified the specific mechanism that had produced the problem, and explained the review process she had built into the new clause to prevent recurrence. She did not argue. She presented. When she finished, Mr. Rhine said, with the careful tone of a man protecting a position he knows is weakened, "The original terms were reviewed and considered adequate at the time of the lease." "Yes," Octavia said, "I understand that. The rate was reasonable against 1837 values. The problem is the absence of a review mechanism, not the initial rate setting. The clause I have drafted addresses the mechanism. It does not reassess the original decision. This was precise, and it was also generous, and it meant that Rhine could accept the revision without the meeting requiring him to acknowledge that he had missed something material. He understood this. She watched him understand it. He said nothing for a moment. One of the investors, a Mr. Harcourt, who had been silent throughout the presentation, and whose silence had been, she thought, attentive rather than dismissive, said, "The 5-year projection. You've used the published Hull Price Index as your market reference." "Yes," she said. "It is the most widely recognized and least susceptible to manipulation. If the council prefers a different index, I can recalculate." Mr. Harcourt looked at the projection. He looked at her. "That will not be necessary," he said. "The Hull Index is appropriate." He set the paper down. "I would like to see a copy of this analysis. My own timber holdings have a lease renewal in March that may benefit from the same approach." The room was quiet for a moment. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Mr. Farshaw, who was not on the council, but was present as an observer, looked at her from the corner with an expression of complete composure and enormous satisfaction. Lord William had not spoken. He spoke now. He said, "The revenue projection assumes the merchant accepts the revised rate." "Yes," Octavia said. "He may not. He may not," she agreed. "In that case, the negotiation proceeds. The estate's position is stronger than the merchant's, because we control the supply, and he requires certainty of access. But I have been conservative in the projection. If the merchant negotiates toward a rate between the current and the proposed, the outcome is still materially better than a 5-year renewal on unchanged terms. I have a secondary table at the back of the document that shows the range of outcomes." Lord William turned to the last page of the document. He read it. His face gave nothing away, which was a face she had come to understand. He was not a man who changed his mind quickly or publicly. But she watched him read the secondary table, and she watched something shift in the set of his shoulders. Not dramatic, not warm, but real. He did not recant his position on the match at that meeting. He would not recant it publicly, not then, not with the entire council present. But after the meeting, when the council had dispersed and Nathaniel had been detained by Mr. Harcourt's continued questions, Lord William walked past Octavia in the corridor and stopped. He said, without looking at her directly, "The secondary table was the correct methodology. Most people present only the best case." She said, "I have spent 6 years presenting to creditors. They always find the worst case themselves. It is better to show them both and remove the uncertainty." He said nothing else. He went down the corridor, and she watched him go. She thought, "That is as much as he will give me, for now." And she thought, "It is something." The formal inquiry came 4 weeks later, in February, and it was not about the timber lease. It was about the £340. The wool merchant, whose name was Garrett Thorne, had been presented with Octavia's summary document by Nathaniel's solicitor in January. He had responded not by acknowledging the discrepancy, but by sending a letter to Sir Aldous Ashworth, claiming that the estate's records were in error and that the transaction in question had been properly documented and countersigned. He had produced what he claimed was the countersignature. The countersignature was not Octavia's. It was, in fact, a reasonable facsimile of Sir Aldous's hand, which told Octavia something she had suspected for some time. The June 1841 transaction was not a merchant's error. It was something that had involved the baronet, whether as participant or as a man whose signature had been used without his knowledge. Both possibilities were complicated in different ways. Nathaniel had called a formal inquiry, not a legal proceeding, but a documented meeting with witnesses, before Mr. Farshaw, Mr. Rhine, both investors, and a magistrate who was a family connection and could serve in a quasi-official capacity if the evidence warranted referral. Lord William attended. Lady Felicity, who had remained a house guest at Ashworth Park through the autumn and winter, had heard of the inquiry by some channel Octavia did not trace, and had arrived at Blackmere Hall 2 days before with the stated reason of visiting Octavia, which was almost certainly not the reason. The inquiry room was smaller than the council room, but had the same quality of historical weight. Octavia sat at the long table with her documents in 2 organized stacks, the original ledger entries and their corresponding merchant invoices in one stack, and the summary analysis and timeline in the other. Mr. Farshaw sat beside her, not as her advocate. She had not asked for an advocate, but as the institutional witness who could authenticate the ledger provenance. Garrett Thorne arrived with a solicitor and the confidence of a man who believed that the word of an established merchant would outweigh a ledger managed by a woman whose position in the household he considered secondary. He had not read her summary document carefully enough. She presented for 19 minutes. She placed each original invoice beside its corresponding ledger entry. She identified, for each of the 8 discrepant transactions she had found, the exact amount, the date, and the entry number. She placed the June 1841 transaction, the largest, at the center of the table and showed the countersignature against 3 authenticated examples of Sir Aldous's handwriting from letters held in the estate records. She placed them side by side without comment. She placed her timeline on the table, the 8 transactions, their dates, the pattern of increasing interval between them, the specific months in which the discrepancies had occurred, which corresponded in 6 of 8 cases to quarters in which Sir Aldous had made unusually large social expenditures that appeared elsewhere in the estate accounts. she said. "I am not in a position to determine whether Sir Aldous Ashworth participated knowingly in these transactions, or whether his signature was used without his knowledge. That determination is properly the magistrate's. What I can document is that the discrepancies exist, that they are systematic rather than accidental, that they total £347 across 31 months, and that the counter-signature on the largest transaction does not match the authenticated examples." The room was very quiet. The magistrate asked her 4 questions. She answered each precisely and without elaboration. Mr. Thorne's solicitor asked her 2 questions that were clearly designed to suggest that the ledger itself was unreliable as evidence. She responded by walking him through the ledger's provenance, every entry dated, every correction initialed, every quarterly summary countersigned by a separate accounting clerk whom she named, and who was available to testify, in a tone so calm and detailed that by the end of his 2nd question, he had stopped trying. When she finished, she folded her hands on the table and was still. Nathaniel had not spoken during the presentation. He sat at the head of the table with the stillness she had come to understand was his version of absolute attention. When she stopped, he looked at the documents in the center of the table for a moment, and then he looked at Thorne, and he said, "The estate will be pursuing formal recovery of the documented sum. Mr. Rhine will correspond with your solicitor regarding the mechanism. The question of the countersignature is referred to the magistrate." Then he rose from his chair and walked around the table to where Octavia sat, and he took her hand, her bare right hand, ungloved, which she had removed to handle documents, and held it for a moment. In front of the magistrate, the investors, Mr. Farshaw, Mr. Rhine, Lord William, and the merchant's solicitor, he bent and pressed his lips briefly to her hand. He straightened and said to the room with the quiet directness of someone making something undeniable, "I should like it to be documented that the entirety of this analysis was produced by the Duchess of Blackmere independently, from her own review of the estate's historical records." She was not yet the Duchess of Blackmere. The wedding was in March. He said it anyway. The room did not erupt immediately. There was a long, suspended moment in which everyone present absorbed what they had seen, the document evidence, the systematic patience it had required to produce, the quality of the presentation, and the Duke of Blackmere, standing with his hand around the hand of a woman who had just taken a fraudulent merchant apart with 9 pages of organized fact. Lord William, at the far end of the table, was looking at the documents still spread across the table. He was not looking at Octavia, but she saw his jaw move, briefly, in the way of a man who is revising something fundamental and does not intend to announce it. Mr. Harcourt said quietly, "I believe I owe you an apology for the nature of my earlier question about your index methodology. I was testing rather than inquiring. The document did not require testing." "All documents require testing," Octavia said. "I was not offended." She picked up her documents and stacked them with her particular, measured precision, and she thought of her father's dining table in 1822, and the 2 creditors, and the repayment schedule she had written out by candlelight. She thought of the February Tuesday in 1841, when she had pressed both hands flat against the writing table, and chosen not to become less than she was. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work, and it had been enough. Nathaniel's hand was still at the edge of her shoulder. She did not lean into it. She was not a woman who leaned easily, but she did not move away. They were married in the 2nd week of March, at the church in the village below Blackmere Hall, in the presence of approximately 80 people, in a ceremony that was proper in every technical respect, and rather shorter than the assembled company had expected. Octavia wore a dress of deep blue that Mrs. Garr had helped her choose, on the grounds that it was exactly the right dress, which was the most efficient possible justification. Margaret had done her hair. Mr. Farshaw had walked her down the aisle, which had not been the original plan, but had become the right arrangement when it was clear that Sir Aldous' attendance was complicated by the ongoing inquiry into the merchant's accounts. At the breakfast afterward, Lord William found her standing near the windows that overlooked the winter garden, which was bare, but had the structural promise of a garden that had been well planted and would be good in spring. He said, "The revised timber clause has been accepted by the merchant's representative. He took the middle rate, as you projected." "Yes," she said, "I expected that." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garden. He said, "Nathaniel's mother would have found you remarkable." He said it in the flat, careful way of someone doing something that cost them something, because they have decided it is accurate, and accuracy is the one obligation they will not avoid. She said, "Thank you, Lord William." He nodded once and went to speak to Mr. Harcourt, and did not reference the matter again. But he came to dinner at Blackmere Hall twice in the month following the wedding, which was 2 more times than he had come in the preceding year. The private proposal had come before all of this, before the inquiry, before the wedding, before the timber lease resolution. It had come on an evening in January, when the library was warm, and Octavia had been at the table with the 3rd revision of the timber clause spread in front of her, and Nathaniel had been at the window for a long time without speaking. He had turned from the window and said, "I have been thinking about how to say this correctly." She had looked up. He said, "I asked for your hand in a way that was expedient, and structurally reasonable, and entirely insufficient. I should like to do it again, differently." He came to the table and stood across from her and said, with the direct, considered simplicity of someone who had thought carefully about what was true, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted to the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most honest person I have encountered in a very long time. And because you heard what was missing from that composition and played it anyway, with an instrument that was imprecise, and I stood in the corridor for 3 nights, because I could not make myself go back to a room where I could not hear it, and because I want, for the rest of whatever time there is, to be in the same room as you." Octavia looked at him for a long moment. She thought about it. She thought about it completely, the way she thought about a contract clause or a discrepancy, the way she thought about things that mattered. She thought about the library in December and the accounts in the morning and the window over the winter garden. She thought about the corridor and the music room and the fact that he had sent for the tuner without saying anything. She said, "Yes, that is what I want as well." He crossed to her side of the table. He took her hand, very carefully, the way he had in the inquiry room, as though he understood that she did not hand things over lightly and wanted her to know he knew this, and held it. They stood like that for a moment. The fire was warm. Outside the library windows, the January dark was absolute and indifferent, and entirely irrelevant. She thought, "I am not going to step aside for anyone," and she thought, "I have not had to." The years that followed built themselves with the same quiet accumulation of well-made decisions. Blackmere Hall, by the spring of 1845, was no longer a house running along its bones. The east wing was opened and refurbished. The kitchen garden walls were repointed. The north pasture boundary dispute was resolved by a document Octavia had drafted herself and sent to the neighboring estate with a covering letter so precise in its legal reasoning that the neighbor's solicitor had written back to ask who had prepared it. The tenant farm agreements were restructured on the model she had developed at Ashworth Park, with yield-linked payments that stabilized income across variable harvests. The supplier agreements were reviewed annually, a practice she had introduced in the first 6 months, and that Mr. Farshaw had formalized into the estate calendar. The annotated ledger system she had developed, 12 volumes by 1847, covering every category of Blackmere's accounts with cross-referenced margin notes and quarterly analysis summaries, was adopted in adapted form by 2 neighboring estates, whose managers had come, through Mr. Farshaw's recommendations and Mr. Harcourt's enthusiasm, to understand that the Blackmere accounts were simply better than theirs. She did not publish a method. She simply explained it, clearly, and without condescension, to anyone who came and asked. In the summer of 1845, their son was born. They named him Thomas Edward, Thomas for Nathaniel's maternal grandfather, Edward for Mr. Farshaw, who had not been consulted, and who, when told, sat very still for a moment, and then said something so quiet that Octavia could not hear it, but whose expression she did not need to misread. Thomas was dark-haired and very loud, and had, from his earliest months, the particular combination of curiosity and stubbornness that Nathaniel recognized as familiar, and Octavia found easy to understand. By the time he could walk, he had the run of Blackmere Hall in the way children who are genuinely loved always do, which is to say, absolutely, and with periodic disaster. The succession was secured, and the question that Lord William had never asked directly, but had always been thinking, was answered by a small person who regularly escaped his crib and was found by Mrs. Garr in the kitchen, demanding bread, and who called the housekeeper M, and called Mr. Farshaw Edmund, with the comfortable assumption of someone who has never been made to feel like a secondary concern. In the autumn of 1847, a daughter arrived. They named her Clara Ann. She had Octavia's eyes and the beginning of what would turn out to be a very fine ear for music, which she demonstrated at 18 months by sitting at the library floor and attempting to replicate a phrase she had heard her mother play. Her father stopped what he was doing and went to pick her up and hold her at the piano bench, and Octavia watched them from the doorway. Clara's small hand flat on the keys, Nathaniel's hand steady beneath hers, and felt the thing she had carried since February 1841 settle finally into its right shape. Not gone, not dissolved, set down somewhere it could rest. She had not expected this. She had expected to manage and survive. She had expected to keep things standing and balanced and precise, and to continue. And she had been prepared to find that enough, because enough was not nothing, and she had known it. She had not expected the warmth. She had not expected the library in the evenings, and the sound of Thomas in the corridor, and Clara's hand on the piano keys, and Nathaniel's voice, low and unhurried, reading to them both in the chair by the fire when the winter came again. He looked up from the doorway and found her watching. She held his eyes. He did not say anything. He simply made room on the bench, Clara between them, both their hands on the keys, and she came and sat beside him, and the room was warm, and outside the Blackmere Park held the deep, indifferent silence of a winter evening, and none of it touched them at all.